Hello, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. We'll continue to admit people for the next couple of minutes. Thank you again. I'm Lila, and with me is Will, and we're two of the founders of Hands Up Education, and we're also two of the authors of Suburani, our new Latin course for secondary schools. If you're completely here for the first time and you're hearing about Suburani for the first time and meeting us for the first time, you'll probably find there's a lot of information that you might think we'd cover and we don't, because the whole story of how Suburani was created, what the kind of principles behind it were, you can see up here on the screen a little bit about all the different focuses that we had when we created the book. We can't really talk about all of that today because we've got this focus on how to use Suburani for preparing students for Latin GCSEs. So we're going to focus very much on that assessment preparation a little bit. And if you are looking at how Suburani works, what the storylines are, how the language progression works and all of that kind of stuff, what technology and digital learning there is to back up everything that we're talking about today, then I could really recommend having a look at some of the pre-recorded sessions that we've done over the past year or 2 years, and they're all available on our website and our YouTube channel. So there's lots more information out there, and if we go really quickly today and there's anything that you think this doesn't make sense to me, then please do send us a message in the chat or interrupt us, because we're going to probably talk about quite a lot of stuff quite quickly. So feel free to tell us when you run into a question. Sorry. So before we get going, I thought I'd just give you a short overview of Suburani Book 1 and Book 2, so that those of you who are new to it have an idea of roughly what happens in the book. And let's see, there it is. So the book is divided into, well, there are 2 books, Book 1 and Book 2, and together they make up a continuous storyline that goes from the Suburra in Rome in Book 1, and that takes our characters through to different locations across the empire, and takes place over about 4 years. So we start the first 6 chapters in the Suburra, and we meet some of the people who have lived there for their whole lives. Sabina, who's a teenage girl who grew up there, and her family, and the other people in her household. Sorry. Was it you, Will? And then we're going to go and have a look at a story set in Roman Britain for the next few chapters before we go back to Rome. I can't make this go back, Will. I don't know.
Sorry, there we go.
And then we're going to follow Sabina, who's kind of our protagonist, as she travels to France and Portugal. And then in Book 2, we pick up in Pompeii, where we see Gisco, who's someone the students know from Book 1 in Quartilla, and that continues their storyline. And the people from Suburra have now become a little bit spread out across the empire in the wake of the Great Fire of Rome. So we've got Sabina, who's in Carthage with her new husband Alexander. We've got Indus and Lucilius, who are in Greece with the Emperor Nero. Rufina, who's Sabina's aunt, is now in Ephesus in Turkey. But at the end of the book, all the storylines converge again in Rome in 68 AD, around the death of the Emperor Nero. That's a very, very quick overview of the rough plot of Suburani. But as we're going to be jumping about a little bit today, looking at different chapters and different books, this should give you a little bit of a foundation and idea of like what we're talking about here. We hope this session will be really useful to you, whether you are completely new to Suburani or whether you're already using the book and you're thinking now, how do I use it effectively to prepare my students for GCSE? And we'll be talking both about preparing students for Eduqas and OCR GCSEs. But if as we go, you run into any question, you think, oh, how does this apply to my set of students or whatever, feel free to put something in the chat, but also you can go onto our website at any time afterwards and arrange to have a talk with one of the team to just talk through how things can work in your school, and we'll have a 15-minute little chat with you to talk about anything that comes out of this session that you'd like to talk about. All right. We're going to talk about language, literature, civilization, preparing for assessment and pacing. And I'm going to start you off by handing you to Will, who's going to talk to you about language.
Thanks, Ida. Okay, so let's start, I guess, looking at the vocab side of things. And I think it's probably worth saying that when we sat down to create the course, you know that you obviously these days you can't create a Latin course without it working very well in the UK for GCSE. So the demands of GCSE and the structure of GCSE in terms of language and literature and civ were right there at the start of our planning fiddle. So hopefully you'll see that in what we've done with the vocab. We sat down and started with looking at the DVLs for both OCR and Eduqas and mapped them together. And when we also looked at high frequency words in literature that aren't part of those DVLs, and put together a sort of a list of words that we knew we would want to focus on and work with through the course. And then of course, as one writes stories, other words join that initial group. We'll see that we track the DVL words really closely all the way through the sort of 3-4 year sort of writing process. The result is that when the students are reading stories, every 3 words they read, 2 of those words will be DVL words. So there's a very high frequency instance of DVL words in the stories. Sometimes as one's writing stories, the words, particularly for us in the way we're set in the Empire, 64 to 68 AD, getting in words such as Rex and Regina, they don't fit very easily most of the time. Whoops. Lana, can you admit Lawrence? Because if I click on my screen, are you seeing that? If I click on my screen, we just change slides. Thanks. So words like Rex and Regina aren't easy to fit into the normal flow story. So those sorts of words, where we could see that we were getting a bit low on frequency of particular DVL words, we put them into language exercises. And then Tony and Lila and Hannah developed software that focuses on the vocab and particularly addresses the items of vocab that students are weak on. So we'll have a little look at that. But all of that to say that hitting the DVL vocab was really a priority for us right from the outset. Let's have a look then just briefly at the vocab trainer. Now this is a made-up class, and I haven't spent too long pretending to be Adam Adams and James Bond and Candy Cane. But when the students use the vocab trainer, for those of you who aren't aware, that then passes information on the student's progress back to the teacher in our system. So teachers can see exactly how students are getting on, and individual students, of course, can see how they themselves are getting on. So if I think the example I chose here was Adam, and we can see here, the last time I did this, he all pretended to be him. He logged in August 2020. If you choose a particular student, then you can see some information there at the top. When did that person last use the trainer? How many times have they logged into it? Be cautious about total time, because they can go away, start it up, go away, have some tea and come back. So the real thing to sort of focus on, I suppose, is words seen, and then how many of those are correct. But just to show you, sort of to drill down, every word is scored between 1 and 10, and the trainer is recording. Every time they get it right, they go up 1. Every time they get it wrong, they go down 1. So the trainer's recording that for each individual student, for each individual word. So that leads to a very high level of sort of specific understanding within the software, and potentially for the teacher as well, of each individual student's sort of strengths and weaknesses. But I found it, when I was covering for a friend last summer, very handy in terms of giving me a good oversight of, how much time is the student spending on their vocab? Can I see their percentages going up? Can I congratulate them when they are putting in some extra effort and they go up in 2 or 3 percentage points overnight, or whatever it may be? So lots of opportunity there to really pick up on individuals and to support them and to praise them, and encourage those who may be less inclined to do their acting. this is just a little example, as I said earlier, of where we struggle sometimes to get some items of vocab into some of the stories. There you can see Rex in A, Regina in E, for example. You will find those more in the individual language exercises. I think I'm the most boring person I know, and I love to work with spreadsheets and sort of analyze vocab. What we did here is we looked at whether a DVL word was in both OCR and Eduqas, and we tagged it as a B. If it was in one but not the other, we gave it an E, and if it was in neither, we gave it an N. And then Dickinson College is an outfit in the US that has analysed, and there's others that do this as well. They've analysed Latin literature for word frequency and which words come up, most frequently. So then we also give the word a 1 if it's in the top 500, a 2 if it's between 500 and 1,000 in terms of its frequency, and then a 3 if it's not in the top 1,000. So that means that a word like puto, which is in both DVLs and is high frequency in literature, gets a B1, and we know to focus on a word like puto, whereas a word like repente, it's not in either DVL, I hope, and it's not in the top 1,000, so it's N3. So if we wanted to, just say suddenly something happens, we'd be more likely to head towards subito than repente. But there will sometimes be occasions when one thinks we're not just going to use DVL words the whole time. Sometimes one wants to add a bit of flavour and get students ready for reading literature where they will be coming across vocabulary that they've not met. So it's not, I hope we haven't done it in a way which is dull, but it has, if you like, it has influenced obviously how we've gone about writing the stories and the language materials. So this is us, just to show you here. This is the start of the sort of the combined DVLs, and then you can also see some words that we've put in, N3 words that we've put in, where we've needed to add flavour to stories. So you can see R, AB, both be 1. The Zoom sort of stuff is overlaying some of this, but oh, bless you. Probably you can see that R and AB have got extended meanings in chapter 20. So where we introduce another meaning of a word, then we tag that for ourselves. Similarly with add, tracking that in chapter 4, story 4, we introduce it with a meaning at. So we're pretty precise, hopefully. No doubt, along the way we've made the odd error, but on the whole, we've tried to be very, very precise about that. And then here you can see this is where we track what sort of type of word it is, when does it first used in the course, which example is it in, that's the Dickinson frequency number there, and then those columns to the right are starting to track, which by the end of that chapter, how many times has this word been used, and then that allows us to pinpoint words that we haven't used for a while and think, okay, now we need to get that word into a story or into a language exercise. So, a lot of care was taken through that, and the result of it is that when we build the learning lists, for each chapter, there's 20 words set for learning. When we build those lists, we're able then to focus in pretty heavily on DVL words. So in book 1, 16 chapters, so 16 learning lists, every word in every one of those learning lists is a DVL word for both OCR and Eduqas. So it doesn't matter which exam board you're preparing for. If the students learn 20 words, those 20 words per chapter through book 1, then by the end of book 1, they've nailed 310 of their DVL words. Well, how many do they have to do? 450-ish, I think, per exam board, something like that, isn't it? That they are a very long way to being ready in terms of vocab, even by the end of book 1. Obviously, we're not able to continue with that because the exam boards diverge on their DVL. So in book 2, what we've tried to do is mark up for you which words in the learning lists are OCR words and which are Eduqas words. And because we were conscious right at the outset that those of us who prepare for Eduqas typically have a little less time than those who prepare for OCR. We all make our own choices, don't we? But I think typically that's the case. So both in the grammar and in the vocab, we wanted to put Eduqas teachers, if we're in that situation, we're tight on time, I want to put them in a position where you're you're done with the vocab and the grammar by the end of chapter 26. If we're doing OCR, there's more grammar in OCR, so one does need to continue to the end of 32, and then the vocab completes at the end of 32 as well. So I suppose that's something to make a note of if you are making notes as we're going along this evening. If you're teaching Eduqas, then Suburani takes you to your end point in terms of the language by chapter 26. And if you're teaching OCR, all the language should be covered by 32. The other vocabulary words are high frequency literature words. And to be honest, almost all the DBL words are also high frequency literature words. And the final thing I think to say on that is that that final point there, really, we don't put a word in a learning list if it hasn't appeared 3 times in a story. I think there are 1 or 2 exceptions to do with deponent verbs when we get to them, or maybe it was a compound of something or other that I thought we can just squeeze this one in. But, you know, out of the 600 and however many words there are in total, I would say 99.5% of them, you see them 3 times a story. So the students should be getting used to the word before it's appearing in a list to learn. Where a word has 2 quite different meanings, like insular, we try to give the students the context for the new meaning as well when it comes along. So here we're sort of finding out about Faustus, and then we see that this word insular, well, it doesn't appear to mean block of flats in this situation. You know, what else might it be? And it is also a nod, I think, to Pliny there, an idea of floating islands and so on. So a little bit of a sort of, hopefully a bit of a useful insight there. These are the vocab learning lists then. So this is book 1, 16 chapters. So this is the first spread of them at the back of the book. We thought we'd put them all together. Partly it's easier from our point of view. It takes up less space in the book, so we can use the open space more wisely. Hopefully it's useful as well from your point of view. You know, if those of us who need to hit the photocopier from time to time, you can get a whole lot of them on one side of A4, A3. If you want to assess the students on everything up to a particular chapter. So, you know, we're learning chapter 5, but the test is going to be on chapters 1 to 5. The students have got all of that in front of them when they're doing their revision, if they're doing it from the, you know, the paper version. So hopefully as you're looking at these chapters 1 through to 16, every word there is a DBL word for you, whichever board you're doing. And as I said earlier, as we move into, this is book 2 now, and you might see on the left-hand page, but at the top there, to the right where it says vocab for learning, to the right of that, you might see that there's a little key. Eduqas words are marked up with a teal diamond, and OCR words with a little purple circle. So that sort of shows, if you're pressed, you might, obviously you may well want the students to learn all the words, but if you want to say just learn the OCR words or just learn the Eduqas words, you can do that. And we've tried to balance out the number per chapter as well as we can if you're doing that. And then you'll see here as we go through to the final chapters of book 2, you know, really, other than in the very final chapter for 32, where really I was just playing around and see, can we get some, you know, particular words in the last chapter. Eduqas words finish at 26, and then it's just OCR, because OCR candidates need to continue through the 32 from the grammar point as well. So that's that. This is just to then show you, you know, to give you some confidence, I hope, on how we have sort of analysed everything. Tony excellently built software so that as we're going along, as we're writing the course, if we want to know when did we last use AGO, you know, we can type it into the software and it will show us every use of AGO that there is in the course, and we can click on one instance and see exactly where in the story is that used. And down the bottom, you might see there, you know, it's telling us when we introduce different meanings of AGO as well. And we're looking to see whether we can make a sort of a version of that just publicly available. So if you're using the course, you'll be able to do that same sort of thing yourself as well. And similarly here, if you look to the bottom left, this is where we can find, from a grammar point of view, we can say, well, show me all nouns that are dative and singular, and it will pull up top right all 150 that then we can scroll through to, if we want to check from a grammar point of view. And we can say, well, actually show me all uses of deus, for example, that are dative singular, and then it will say, well, there are your 5 of them. So it's pretty precise, very handy, and it just gives us that extra sort of ability to be careful, I think, when we're writing. Okay, very quickly, just to let you know what gets introduced when, in terms of those vocab lists, and we map where these ideas come in the vocab list to where we teach them in the course. So, gender pretty early on, and rather than going to the genitive for nouns, we use the accusative in chapter 2 when we introduce that, and switch to the genitive later on, and so on. Infinitive comes in 5, and the first person of the perfect in 7. So by chapter 7, you're getting the first 3 parts of the of the verb. Okay. Let's have a little look at grammar and how we do that. First of all, just to show you, for those of you who aren't aware of the course, it's a reading course with quite a high amount of sort of visual support for the students. This is chapter 14, and we're starting to introduce here the future tense. And we introduced the future tense with just the first 2 conjugations. And if you look in box 6 there, I think the next slide sort of zooms in on that. You can see, this is how we go about introducing a bit of grammar, and I've just used this as an example. It's very similar for everything, really. We look, what do the students already know? And if you look at how laboro is being used in box 6 there, they've met the perfect, they've met the present, and that, we're using heri, hodie, and then cras to lead them into getting the right idea for that. So we'll, that's how we start off, and you'll see here in 11 aduo and cras aduabo. So when we're introducing a future form for the first time, here right at the outset, we think, okay, well, let's give them it in a form they already know, so they're okay with the vocabulary and with the sort of the overall idea, and then let's just morph that a little bit and see if they can see what's going on. And then in 12, we're doing that with a verb then they've not met before, and think, okay, well, can you, if you have got an idea of this pattern, can you apply what's coming out of that pattern to this new word? They've got the vocab there at the bottom, so it's a sort of a stepped approach. And then a language note, fairly straightforward, I think, really. This is what it would look like in the present. This is what it's looking like in the future. Can you spot the difference? Let's draw some conclusions, and so on. So fairly sort of steady, I think. Language practice activities in the book. This is from chapter 6, where we're working on the ablative. So, a few activities we put in the book, and then we expand, and this is work in progress, but this is expanding then for more activities online, and really there's no end to the sorts of things that we can put on there, and because we're non-profit, and because all the money that comes in from the course goes back into supporting it and supporting classics and generally, we don't see this ever as sort of ending. It's a continuous activity of thinking, what do people need, what else can we do, how can things be improved? So it will only grow and grow, I think. For those of you interested in what the sort of scope of the language is, here it is. The 3 language columns are because there are 2 to 3 language points each chapter. So, for example, chapter 1 looks at first, second, and third person present tense, and then it looks at how do we actually go about reading Latin, sort of what order of words do we take, and so on. Other chapters have 3. Well, we do have 3. We try to keep them connected in some way. So if you look at chapter 9, well, you could say in some ways that's all one point, isn't it? Dative singular, dative plural, and then verbs with the dative. But I think in our experience, students can struggle a bit with the dative termination, so we thought let's just sort of smooth them out over the chapter. Perhaps a little unusual to bring in indirect statement early on in 15, but we thought actually, particularly if you're using Eduqas, only uses present active infinitive, doesn't it? It's not that hard from Latin to English, so we thought we'd do that, and that would give them plenty of confidence with the structure. And then this is book 2, and those with a sort of cream background are OCR only. So those students are going on to do OCR and GCSE, you know, when the sort of more challenging indirect statements come along, well, at least the students have had plenty of experience of the overall structure. You can see there what we've tried to do is ensure that you know, the OCR material is towards the end of the course. So Eduqas people, if you are in a bind for time, you know, you don't need to go beyond 26. I mean, hopefully you will, because the story's pretty gripping and exciting, we hope, so you'll want to. One or two things for OCR did come in before that, because we thought, you know, include perfect passive, we're really going to put it somewhere else when we've done PPPs and perfect passive. It's so straightforward. And similarly, really, of course, for Eduqas, one has to do deponent verbs. Well, you can't list deponent verbs unless you do perfect passive infinitives. So we had to touch on that one there. Okay. Just to quickly to show from a grammar, because I'm going on for too long, from a grammar point of view, just as for the vocab, we can track it. So with all the activities that work on the student's grammar, and this is a, you know, automatic grading of translations, we've now built the software so that it can track that and track how the students get on, and it can feed that back to you, so you can look to see what sort of mistakes was an individual student making in their work in the software. It won't always get it right, of course, but it will give the student immediate feedback, and it will allow you to plan your next lesson. You can set that work, you know, that activity, one lesson, and you can see how they've got on before the next lesson. You can plan your next lesson based on their responses. Similarly, this, I hope my daughter doesn't mind. So this is a sorting, a categorization activity, just on person of the verb. You know, she's done okay, but you can probably see there that actually, if there is something she's getting wrong, it's first persons of the verb, first person singular. So, you know, that's just something for me to know. If I want to sit down with her, I'll just sort of have a look at those and make sure we sort of reinforce those a bit more. Okay, so I suppose all of that saying, what we're trying to do is really put us all, when we're teaching, in a position where we've got really individualized knowledge about each individual student. So we move away from a mass of, you know, 30 people to 30 individuals. Okay, sorry, Lila, I've talked too long. Oh, back to you.
No worries. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the stories in the course will prepare you for moving on to reading original Latin literature with your students. And we've really worked throughout the two books to create a really smooth transition. So as you work through book 1 and book 2, you'll find that the stories sort of gradually increase in complexity, and they become more and more like real Latin texts, and the idioms they use and the language features they use. And then at the end of book 2, we're really hoping that the jump from their reading original Latin literature will be one that the students are kind of ready to make. One of the ways we do that is what Will's just talked about a lot already, is about practicing the vocabulary. You know, we're not looking just at how can we make sure they know that defined vocabulary list really well, but how can we make sure that those highly frequent words that we know are going to come up when they read original Latin literature are a part of their sort of core vocabulary. And that goes beyond the words that are included in the learning list to just having exposure to words again and again, so that by the time they come to encounter them in another text, it's something that's not new to them as much as possible. So by the end of book 2, the stories we're writing in chapters sort of 29 to 32 are really starting to feel more and more like the kind of things you might find in real authors. And here's a story from chapter 32 called Ultimahora, which is about the death of Nero, that is very closely modelled and really adapted from a bit of Suetonius dealing with the death of Nero. And this was really interesting to do, because when we went and looked at the Suetonius, it was just so exciting to see how much of those language structures and of those words our students knew. We didn't have to work really, really hard to find simpler words or different phrasings. We could take quite a lot of that Latin that was in the Suetonius and put it onto the page in Suburani. We did obviously make some changes to make it a bit more accessible, and also we wanted to change the plot a little bit. Gisco and Indus are present at the death of Nero. But if you look here, you can see in green everything on the right is language that is either precisely or nearly precisely lifted into the Ultimahora story. So we're very close to reading original Latin literature with students by the end of book 2. But looking back this is not really the first time that we've done this kind of thing. And particularly in book 2, there are lots of stories that are modeled on and based on or adapted from stories and writings from Roman authors. So we've got in chapter 17 a story that's based on Catullus, or borrows heavily from Catullus 13, the one that goes, "Come to dinner at my house, Fabulous, but make sure you bring your own food along." There's a story, Windemia, which is about wine growing or grape growing, that is modelled on a letter by Pliny. And I thought I'd show you here, this story here in chapter 31 is, 30, is Solve Curas Tuas, and it's a pretty literary story of Gisco, who goes and manages to conjure up the ghost of his now dead wife Catia. Oh God, this is just full of spoilers. If you thought Nero was going to survive, no, neither does Catia. And when I was writing this, we took inspiration from Aeneid 2, and we modelled Catia's speech to some extent on Creusa's, so Aeneas's wife, as she appears to him as a ghost and tells him to move on with his life and say goodbye and take their son and raise him by himself. And with an interested class, this can be a really nice opportunity to lead to a discussion of the similarities and the differences between Creusa and Catia and their speeches and how the language is used, and maybe dipping into the original passage in Aeneid 2, because you'll find probably at this stage they're kind of, with a bit of support, going to be able to access a text like that and do some really close analysis of, well, do you think Creusa is a model for Catia, and why is she, how is she different, and how is she the same, and what kind of language is used to describe how Gisco responds versus how Aeneas responds. So we really are making these moves that would allow you to get into the kinds of analysis that you can do with your students when you're reading original Latin texts. And the teaching manuals here are a really useful resource at giving you ideas for, it will tell you obviously when there are references within a story to a different passage, and often it will give you the passage reference in the teacher manual as well. So it might give you the Latin with an English translation or without, and introduce some discussion questions or some ideas that you could work with your students. So this is kind of towards the end of book 2, when obviously we're looking at students that are going to be nearly able to read Aeneid 2 by themselves with their teachers, as actually evidenced by the fact, which I didn't know before a couple of days ago, that this is actually a little bit of set text for OCR literature at the moment. But these skills and this kind of language use we've actually developed quite carefully from much earlier on in the course. So looking back here at book 1, twice. Here's the story of Flammai, is in chapter 12, and this is set during the Great Fire of Rome. And this is not modelled on any bit of Latin, although I think there is a reference or two in there. Bless you, Carolyn.
Sorry.
And here you'll see that the teaching notes on the right-hand side that I've copied in here was an extract from the teacher notes. Give some really specific ideas about how you can pick up on the language used within the extract with your students, and what kind of questions you can ask them about what the effect is of the words that are used. Why did the author make the choices they did? And how does it change how you perceive what's going on in the story? So there's a little note there about lines 11 and 12 about chiasmus, and the teacher note explains kind of, okay, well, this is the kind of word order you see, and this is known as chiasmus, and then what do you think is the effect? Does it present the men and the horses as equals, or will the shouting and the neighing blend together or be distinct from one another? And if you want to do this, you can do this with your students in chapter 12. And even in earlier stories, there are lots of instances where the word order has been changed a little bit that you can pick up with your students. There's some repetition, some alliteration, and to the extent that you want to, you can start to introduce those skills of asking them, you know, what is the way that the language is used here? What does that do for how we interpret the story? So that when the time they come to the second book and towards reading original literature and doing that literary analysis, they're drawing on the skills of close analysis that they've built up over the past years that they've been studying in Suburani. But it's not just in the Latin stories that we're preparing them for how to interpret texts with this close analysis. The civilization sections of each chapter have a lot of primary evidence in them. And where we can, we often introduce quotations in Latin. This is spread from chapter 1, book 1, page 12 and 13. And on the left-hand side there, you'll see this little line from Marshall about life in the Subura. Tu eras clamosa in Subura. You wander about in the rowdy Subura. By the time they get to this page, they've read exactly one story in Latin, but they do know the verb form, second person and two, and they know what clamosa means. They've met that before, meaning noisy or loud, and they know in Subura, they know what the Subura is. So they can access this little bit of Latin, and they can already make have some sense of like, okay, the translator here said the Subura is called rowdy, so they've translated clamosa as rowdy. I thought it meant noisy. Well, are noisy and rowdy the same thing? And why do you think the translator thought this was the appropriate choice for describing Subura when they chose that translation of clamosa? And on the right-hand side, you'll see this little passage from Juvenal that is given in translation, but the questions that go below it are a way of getting students to look quite carefully at what is in this text and how reliable do they think Juvenal's description is. And that's a way for them to get into, okay, well, this is a piece of poetry, and there's a little bit of, at the top, a little bit of context about who Juvenal was, and he complains of the difficulties of living in Rome. Okay, how seriously should we take him? So even in the civilization sections, there are lots of opportunities for getting students to think about encountering different authors and thinking about how we can learn from literature and how to pick up on those details about Roman life, and as well as how language is used to make those points. Just a final aside, this is just a little thing I happened to notice, is that if you are doing OCR or Eduqas in the coming years, Boudicca is a prose lit set text for either of those. And in chapters 8 and 9, this is a central storyline to Suburani. So those of you who have students sitting the GCSE in the next couple of years and who are doing book 1, take note when you're doing this chapter. And if your students seem to enjoy Boudicca, then there's an opportunity. Now, we can't say that all of the prose set texts in the next few years are going to always find a parallel within Suburani, but sometimes you're lucky. And then I thought I'd move on to talking to you a little bit about how we do civilization and culture in Suburani and how that's designed to prepare students for the GCSE. Now, really, when we went and decided what to do in terms of the culture and civilization, history and mythology, we didn't think, let's go and check what the syllabus is of the different examples at the moment, partly because it changes all the time, but partly because we felt it was really important to create a course that really covered everything that we thought was essential about Roman life and that we thought was interesting about Roman life, and that from working with teachers and asking a lot of people their opinions, we thought was likely to appeal to students and give them a good foundation on which they could grow from then on. So they're focused on exploring things like religion, slavery, the role of men and women, contrast between the rich and the poor, the Roman army, daily life in the provinces, all those kind of standard topics that you might expect your students to encounter. But we've also added in quite a few things that are unlikely to come up in exams, and we've added them because we thought they'd be interesting and they might be fascinating to some students. So we've got several sections on things like technology. We've got a section on bread making, we've got perfume, we've got poison, we've got attitudes to the sea and animals. So there's a wide ranging set of topics, and some might come up in examinations and some might not. And I think it's important to remember as well that GCSE syllabuses cannot be based on any textbook, although you can write a textbook to match a syllabus. And because those syllabuses change all the time, you can't imagine that when you pick up Suburani, it will definitely cover every bit of whatever civ topic you might end up doing, whether you're doing OCR or whether you're doing Eduqas. But we're really looking forward to developing some supplementary resources to help bridge that gap. So we've got a lot of experience over the years. All of the Hands Up team used to be working at Cambridge School Classics Project, and at that place we've developed a lot of supplementary materials to support the Eduqas and the WJC qualifications. So we're really keen that we help teachers to bridge that gap, to have documents that help them work out where in the book the relevant sections are they need for any one module, and to create resources that will answer any bits that aren't covered. So if I look ahead here, these are the current topics set for the next couple of years for OCR and Eduqas. And if you look at, for instance, OCR entertainment right at the bottom there, we've got the theatre in Pompeii is one of the set topics. Now, Suburani doesn't do the theatre in Pompeii, it does the theatre in Arelate in southern France. It's not very terribly different from the theatre in Pompeii, it's a gorgeous theatre as well. And we do Pompeii when we get to book 2. So it will be one of those cases where it will be simple for us to create some extra resources that particularly go into looking at the theatre of Pompeii. And a Suburani student will be able to say, how is it different to the theatres we've seen in the south of France, and how is it the same? And we can create things like that. And now that we are done with book 2, we're really excited to be able to move on to creating the resources that people need. And also because we are a community effort, if this is the kind of thing that you're interested in, if you are preparing your students for any one of these topics and you've got resources and things you'd like to share, then we'd really love to hear, and we'll be able to work with a group of people, I'm sure, that will fill in all these gaps and make sure that there's lots of support available to help you teach any topic that you're interested in. No, I don't know. Yeah. Will,
Okay.
talk to us about pacing.
Thanks, Lila. All right. Well, you know, we all teach in different situations, don't we? And sort of the amount of time that we have to get to GCSE, again, was something that was really important to us when we started sort of planning it all out. So just a quick recap. Overall, the book, the course is 2 books. Each book is 16 chapters. Each chapter has the same structure of 16 pages, 10 pages language, 5 pages civ, and then 1 is either myth or history. So in terms of pacing, I think what we try to do when we planned the sort of grammar development and the cultural development and so on was to make sure that each chapter was pretty much the same amount of study, so that it isn't that you go quickly to start with and then, oh, now it's getting it's getting really hard and there's a ton of content, and suddenly this chapter is twice the length of the early chapters. So that might mean that you don't go super quickly through the first chapters, but it should also mean that you shouldn't sort of run into treacle in later chapters. And I would say, sort of as a very rough sort of guide, I would say we're looking at 2 weeks per chapter at the fastest pace. If you've got 2 lessons per week there, and you're sort of starting in sort of year 9, maybe year 10, then 2 weeks per chapter. But there's so much content and depth that what we find from a lot of the trial schools is that those that have got more time spend much longer, and we'll have a look at that. So these are the 16 chapters of each book, 32 overall. Just as a recap then, those of us doing Eduqas, you need to get to at least 26. Those of us doing OCR need to do all 32. Okay. You know, I would always say that this sort of thing depends on hours per week, because you can start in year 10, and if you've got 3 hours per week, you've actually got a huge amount of teaching time. Average teaching time from scratch in a non-selective state school, so to go from 0 to GCSE, average teaching time is 211 hours. In an independent school and a state selective school, grammar school, average teaching time is 288, 290 hours in total. So when you're thinking about your planning, think in those terms. If we start with the sort of those of us who've got 3 years, so we start teaching in year 9, we go through to exam in year 11, you know, really roughly speaking, if you want to do all 32 chapters, then it should be okay to do book 1 in year 9 and book 2 in year 10. And I was covering for a good friend last summer, and at the school they start in year 9. The school does Eduqas, and by Easter they had finished chapter 26. So in 5 terms, those guys, and it's a non-selective state comprehensive school or academy, in 5 terms the students have done all the language content. So they started in year 9, by Easter of year 10 they'd finished chapter 26, and of course they actually going on reading more of the course, partly because things like average of absolute and so on are going to be handy for the literature, but it means they've got over a year then of language consolidation there. If you've got less time, if you're doing it, and not many of us are left, I think, doing 2 years, but if you are doing GCSE in 2 years, then chapters 1 to 19 in a year means 2 weeks per chapter. That's the sort of pace you want to work on. If we then look down to 4 to 5 years, what we're finding from the trial schools that started now, sort of this is their 3rd year, they then are on the whole doing a book over 2 years. They might go a bit more quickly, I think, in years 9 and 10, simply because they'll have more teaching time available. But what we're hearing again and again and again is that they just love the depth and go into things in more detail. So anyway, that's a rough guide to how I would pace it out, I think, all things being equal with that amount of time. Okay, Lana, sorry, back to you.
Yeah, I thought we'd talk to you a little bit about how the resources that we've built around Suburani help prepare your students for essentially exams, the skills they need to answer questions of the type that they'll see in their GCSEs. Firstly, here we've got some examples of the kind of ancillary resources that we've got that surround any typical chapter. And you'll see, for instance, on the left here for chapter 17, there's a set of comprehension questions for the story Familia Ampliati, and we've got question sheets like this for every chapter for sure, for at least one of the stories, but they're growing all the time. So we're moving towards a place where you can really pick a story in any chapter and say, okay, I want to use this story to have a go at getting my students to answer questions like this, where they've got to show that they understood the Latin, give a little bit of evidence for it, make sure that they check how many marks are allocated to the question, and then give the amount of detail that they need. And then they're probably going to lose a mark because they didn't think, what exactly does the question say, or which line does it refer to, and all of that kind of little bits of practice. They can get that from doing these kinds of comprehensions if you want. There are lots of them, and obviously the book is not full of them because we want to make it as easy as possible for you to think, what do I want to do with this story? Am I going to read it with a class together? Am I going to then follow it up with an activity where they act it out? Or am I going to follow it up with an activity where I get them to practice comprehension questions? There are so many options for you to go through the course and get them to build those skills when you want, but there's lots of resources to help you do it. Will's going to talk later a little bit about how to use the course to differentiate, but if you look at the top there, that exercise 1H is an example of an exercise that you can download for chapter 6, where you can get students to translate English into Latin. If that's something you are thinking you want to prepare your students for, that's a bit of the GCSE exam that you'd like them to enter. There isn't a huge amount in the book, if you look through, that will really help them with that, although there are quite a lot of gap filling exercises and build sentence exercises, which will help them get towards producing their own Latin. But there are online quite a lot of these kinds of exercises that you can pick up for certain chapters, and there's an answer sheet for them as well, I think, so that they can get that practice of doing English into Latin. And in both book 1 and book 2, at the back of the book, we've got not just the normal dictionary and the learning list, but we've also got a little English to Latin dictionary, which is just one spread in the book, so they can have that open on their desk. And it's based on the restricted vocabulary lists that they'll need to know for their GCSEs. And on the right as well, you see there's a little comprehension in Latin called Decem Questiones, and there's quite a lot of those online as well for various stories in the course. And they are also a way of, if you want to do more produced Latin with your students, you want to get them to use to writing a little bit. These are often one-word answers, but they're just ways of getting them to pick out a little bit of information in Latin and write it down in Latin and get used to writing their own. There are loads of exercises on there. There's lots created by us for each chapter, but there are also lots created by the community, and those are growing all the time. And I think as we go on, we'll see more and more activities created by teachers who are particularly wanting their students to prepare for exam style questions, but probably particularly in book 2, I imagine. So there's going to be lots of stuff available for you if you want to do more practice than what's available in the book to get them prepared for exams. But in addition, we have been working on some assessments that accompany each chapter in the course. So there will be 32 of these in a few months. They're not going to all be there tomorrow. And all of these are full tests on a particular chapter. So to really get you can use these to see how much have my students understood of the language. Often they refer well to a bit of the storyline, and get them to sit a proper assessment on this. So whereas the things we were talking about earlier, I would say you can use them as assessments, but they're kind of more practice informative. You could use this as a sort of like, okay, we're going to sit down in the class for an hour and we're going to do this kind of GCSE style exam moment. You can use these to do mocks as well if you wanted to. So here is a story on the left-hand side, Manera out Albire 2. It follows on from a story in the book, and it's written specifically for this assessment. And it uses all the kinds of words that are in the learning vocabulary list. It heavily features the language that was used in this chapter. And on the right-hand side, we've got comprehension and translation questions of just the type that they might see in their GCSE exams. And this is accompanied by a mark scheme as well, so you can mark it precisely using that. And then this whole assessment will include further parts. So you won't have time to look at all this, but there you go. On the next bit, I've repeated the text, so it's there again, but you'll see part B will be some grammar questions where you can ask them to identify certain forms in the text. So this is kind of the spot the grammar bit. And we're looking forward to building these out a little bit more. So part C might be grammar practice, where we give them some sentences to translate, particularly with the language feature of that chapter. We might build a part that is English into Latin for those of you who'd like to practice that, a part on derivations, and there'll also be a part on the culture and civilization, maybe the history and the myth of that particular chapter. So these are available for you to use. Probably you wouldn't want to do this every chapter because you'd spend as much time assessing your kids as you'd spend teaching them. But at those points in the year where you really want to check in with them and give them that practice, they're there for you, and they'll really model what they'll be doing at the end in year 11. Right. Will, would you like to talk about differentiation?
Great, thanks, Lina. Yeah, okay, let's have a quick look through differentiation then. I mean, the first thing to say that, and I'll go very quickly on this, I think, because looking down the list, most of us here tonight are, are users of reading courses and probably pretty familiar with this. But if you're not used to a reading course, it does lend itself to differentiation by its nature. So if we just look at that sort of first line there, and I really chose this today at sort of random, this story. What I'm honest, you could take that sentence and ask all sorts of differentiated questions about it. You could ask them to translate it. You could ask, what hour is it? And think, well, which word there are we focusing in on? We're giving them 2 out of the 3 words, really, aren't we? If we ask a question like that, they might say, it's the 9th hour. It doesn't necessarily tell us whether they understand what time it is. So one could say, well, it's the 9th hour. Yes, is it before noon or is it afternoon? You could start differentiating that sort of thing out to say, well, actually, what time of day is it in our system? And of course, that changes throughout the year. So if it's this month, what time of day would it be? And then if somebody is, really wants to go in and sort of do a lot of detail on that, and you can say, well, it's in this place on this day of this month in this year. Now, what would that be? So you can take, you can really differentiate and expand out on that side of things. You can ask them all sorts of questions to do with, the grammar of it. And you can move into the sort of cultural side of, okay, let's make a sundial, give a presentation and so on. So, I mean, that's just to say, really, with any reading course, you can differentiate, can't you, in many different ways, just on any individual sentence almost. With the tech that we have behind, I might say to my students, if I want to make things a little bit easier or quicker, I might say, okay, you can get your phones out and read, and just click to get the vocab. And then we have a sort of an option choice. They can click not only to get the vocab, but also to parse if they need that. So, and I know some of us are a bit cautious about that, and we are looking into a system that we can build behind the scene that will give teachers control over that. So we'll allow, the teacher will be able to set, can the students click or can't they click, or how many times can they click, and so on. That's not there yet, but it is, I know it's something that we are keen to do. But again, differentiation through sort of access to technology. Just sort of quickly, this is one of the first stories or the first story in the book, where we're looking at first, second and third person singular. So if you look in 11, you can see laboro, and we've got in 10 laboras. So we're looking at the persons of the verb there, and you can see as well, I think we've got 16, 17, legis and lego and so on. And this is the language node, and it's similar to the one that we looked at earlier on, but very simply saying verb ends in OSTs, he, she or it. But then differentiation for those who want to go more deeply online through these sort of language note plus activities. And again, we're just working on these. There are, you know, there are more to come. There's more work to be done here. But of course, some of us will want to teach about the 4 conjugations at that point, or some of us will want to teach a few students about the 4 conjugations at that point. So in terms of differentiation there, what we're trying to do is all the way along the way say, okay, you know, we'll take it fairly gently in the book, but online we can extend that if we want to. And similarly, here's a language activity from the textbook itself where they need to apply the right termination, and they've got both the Latin and the English to help them do that. But then online, a little bit as Lila touched on earlier on, we've got, you know, here we are. Okay, now choose, in that first one, choose from 3. In the second one, slightly easier, choose from 2 options. Here, choose from a pool above. So really, that could be a really choice made on vocabulary knowledge rather than termination. Then the next one, well, now this is a bit harder. We're just translating it. Here, it's very much the same activity in E, but without the termination. Those students have to supply themselves, and you can decide whether you think, whether you mind about them getting that sort of intervening vowel right or not. And the next one, they're not given any support. They have to, you know, find the whole verb themselves. And then finally building up to translate the whole thing. So all of that to say that we're doing our best really to, you know, to do that work that we might all ourselves individually do. I think, oh, okay, well, how can I differentiate this activity for these students? Well, you know, we can sit here and do that stuff centrally, so so that we all benefit from that. Okay, very quickly to end with, I mean, this is probably I think the most important thing that we need to all be thinking about. What can we do to increase cohort size? And you know, I'm sure some of you may have been, I was at the DFE meeting about this 4 million for Latin in 40 state schools. Well, you know, I would say it's a little bit like pumping up a leaking tire. Unless we can hold the fort with what we've got, then, you know, well, so anyway, let's focus on holding the fort. And part of it is this, is as Lila started with, it's that, you know, we need to take a variety of approaches. So that's what we're trying to do, really, with appealing to everybody and making the course accessible to as many people as we can. That's what differentiation obviously fits into that, and trying to, you know, to correct some of the things that maybe haven't always been done as well as they can be done in courses. And I mean, very kindly, you know, that some of these may be from some of you, but you know, this first quote here, you know, it's refreshing to see counts of different races, women, just, you know, and so on. That this is important, I think, because if we can speak to more students, or we can speak to our students in a more honest and engaging manner, and in a manner which includes them, they are more likely to stick with us. And if we don't, you know, quite rightly should they leave. And the second quote there, just to, you know, to give you some confidence that it might be okay. So this is, I don't know, for me, Zoom is overlaying the very top line. So if you can't see it, average cohort size for GCSE, non-selected schools, 11 candidates. Could be 13. There's quite a lot of schools, non-selected schools, where there are only 1 or 2 candidates. And what I really need to do is call them up and find out, were those candidates their own candidates? As sometimes there are. I hear from some schools that they just put 1 or 2 candidates through. Sometimes they're private candidates, so not always can you be entirely certain there. If we're around that 11 candidate mark, we are ripe for, you know, sort of the axe, aren't we, if we're not careful? So I think it really does matter that we think, how can we appeal to absolutely everybody of all abilities, and some, and I wouldn't really call it research as much as asking around, but what I'm hearing, and it'd be interesting to see whether you guys are hearing the same thing, is that those of us who are teaching students who are getting 2s and 3s in their other subjects are finding that those students can also get 2s and 3s in Latin. And it may be that a lot of us don't teach students who don't teach in schools where there's much of that about, but some of us do. And I think after years and years and years of Latin being very severely graded, it does seem to be the case that grading of Latin at the top end, 7, 8, 9, is now in line with everything else. And as far as I can see, actually, it's a little bit more lenient. As students, if you look at in the schools where I've analysed, if you look at their results, tend to do a little bit better in Latin, maybe only a sort of half a grade than they do elsewhere. But I think that's reassuring. And I think also at the other end of the spectrum, this what seems to be coming through is that at least the grading at the lower end of the spectrum is okay. So if we're not teaching Latin to the full ability range in a school where these students exist, and we've been thinking we're not going to do that because they won't manage it, but from what I can see of the data of the students who've tried it at that sort of 2, 3 level, then they do seem to be able to make their way through in the same level in Latin. All backgrounds, for sure, all interests, and this is every individual, and that's one of the reasons why we're so keen on the software being able to track exactly how each individual student is doing, so that we can have individualized conversations with those students to really work on what are their weaknesses, really support them. So there's no magic bullet, really. I think what we've tried to do is create a course which is hopefully going to engage a variety of students. I had a teacher just write yesterday to say what he's finding is, because he's teaching quite an urban environment, actually, the course, the sort of the urban setting of the start of the course, that very urban setting of Rome, so really appealing to the kids who are themselves living in flats and in a very high urban environment. So whose eyes we see the world through, I think it matters in terms of engaging as many kids as possible and informing all of us, and looking in detail, who are these people, and have we got everybody here, everybody that's in the school, are we representing them in the course? So we've really tried to do that, and no doubt, obviously, one could always do better, but hopefully, you'll see there the course takes sort of a range of approaches. Here, those of us who live out in the countryside, a very rural environment, there as well. Okay, that's probably a good sort of point at which to stop. There's 24 things in the messages in the chat. Have we got questions and so on? We've gone a little, well, I mean, we could be here all night. Does anyone want to ask some questions? We pull up the chat and see. If you've got a question, you want to just turn your mic on, go ahead. There's no questions. No. Okay.
Does Rufina own the bar she works in? Yes, she does. Yes, you told your students right. She does, and it's a little bit unusual, perhaps. But the backstory we've got behind it is that she probably at one point owned it with a man, perhaps a husband she had. In fact, we do reveal that she used to be married right in chapter 31, I think. And upon his death, she would inherit his property, and that did happen. So even it's not probably the case that she went and set up a bar by herself completely. There's a bit of a story behind that, but yeah, she does as a woman own a bar.
Yeah.
And did Sabina learn to read? Yeah.
Yeah, we debated that quite a bit, didn't we? And there's a question of whether is she reading or is she just sort of picking out little bits and pieces and so on. There's some questions here. I think it looks like you've picked up on them Lila, have you in the chat? But this is about, Ginny, you were asking about sort of digital versions of the assessments. Actually, that we have done that sort of thing, played around with that software in the past and made bits and pieces like that. And when we're writing these assessments, actually, we are writing with the idea that, you know, we want them to be able to be switched across the digital format as easy as possible. So that is absolutely on the to-do list. And as I say, the technology is pretty much there. Okay, are there any other questions that anyone feels weren't answered in the chat? No. Okay. Well, we're always here, you know, so if you've got any questions at any point, just shout. Lila, have you got anything to add?
No, yeah, just I think you've all got our email address, so do send us an email if you want to, and on our website you can find lots of more sessions and ways to chat to us individually as well if you've got a question that comes up after. And thank you all for the lovely feedback.
Yeah,
people saying their students are really enjoying it. It's so great to hear.
It really makes a difference, because, you know, you write these things and got no idea if it's going to work. So it is lovely to hear that it is working. And you know, if you want us to do things that, you know, don't yet exist, just let us know, because, you know, that's what this next year is about, is building more resources. Great.